Late 1939, Britain moves to approve a new standard infantry rifle, the No. 4 Lee-Enfield, even while that design remains fundamentally bolt-action and mechanically descended from actions first developed in the closing years of the 19th century. In practice, most soldiers actually entering the early campaigns would still carry the older, short-magazine Lee-Enfield No. 1 Mark III Star until wartime production of the No. 4 could be ramped up. Meanwhile, Germany was fielding the K98K with its 5-round magazine, and the United States had already adopted the semi-automatic M1 Garand. Against that background, Britain doubled down on a manually operated rifle and put its faith in training and handling speed rather than automatic fire. Critics of the day called the decision a mistake. Advocates of modernization labeled it an embarrassment. Bolt-action rifles, they warned, belonged in museums, not on modern battlefields. Yet practice would soon expose the limits of that assumption. The skepticism had clear technical grounds. By the 1930s, many armies and theorists were convinced that semi-automatic service rifles were the logical evolution of infantry weapons. A well-trained soldier with an M1 Garand could sustain rates of aimed fire that outstripped what a typical bolt-action shooter could deliver. The Garand's gas-operated mechanism cycled the action for the firer, ejecting spent cases and loading fresh rounds, so the shooter's job was simply to aim and pull the trigger. A bolt action, by contrast, required a 4-part manual sequence after each shot: lift the bolt, pull it back, push forward, lock down. Movements that ate time and broke the sight picture. On paper, the semi-automatic clearly had the edge. British decision-makers recognized the problem and explored alternatives. Between 1930 and 1933, the Small Arms Committee ran exhaustive trials of several semi-automatic contenders, including the Vickers-Armstrong's Pedersen concept and the Danish Bang design. Neither met the practical needs of an empire preparing for large-scale mobilization. The Pedersen rifle demanded specially lubricated cartridges, an unacceptable logistic fragility in the mud and dirt of field service. The Bang mechanism proved too delicate under sustained use. Beyond pure mechanics, there were wider considerations: cost, the existing logistics of .303 British ammunition across the empire, and the industrial disruption that wholesale retooling would cause during a rapid rearmament program. Britain already possessed millions of Lee-Enfield rifles, billions of rounds, and factories, training centers, and supply chains built to support them. Those factors carried enormous weight. When war broke out in September 1939, the No. 4 still existed largely as prototypes and tooling samples. Production only climbed as the conflict matured. 3 major wartime factories came online in 1941 to answer demand. ROF Maltby in Yorkshire produced a very large run. ROF Fazacurley in Liverpool, sometimes rendered in sources as Fazacurley/Phaser Curley, and BSA's Shirley Works in Birmingham also contributed hundreds of thousands of rifles. North American factories under license and lend-lease contracts added still greater numbers. Savage in the United States and Long Branch Arsenal in Canada manufactured Lee-Enfield rifles for Commonwealth use and for export to units that required them. The aggregate output, British and international, would ultimately number in the millions.
What opponents of the Lee-Enfield overlooked was that the rifle was not merely an old pattern. It was a highly refined bolt action with design features that made it exceptionally fast to operate in skilled hands. The secret was the action. Where many contemporary service rifles, notably the German Karabiner 98K and many Mauser derivatives, used front-locking lugs that required about a 90-degree bolt rotation to unlock and relock, the Lee-Enfield used rear-locking lugs. That permitted a markedly shorter bolt throw, typically in the region of 60 to 70 degrees, and therefore a far quicker flick of the hand. The difference is more than theoretical. With a Mauser-type action, the shooter's hand must come higher and rotate further. With a Lee-Enfield, the motion is a compact slide and push that keeps the cheek welded to the stock. Add to that the Lee-Enfield's cock-on closing characteristic, which spreads the mechanical work of cocking the striker across both opening and closing movements, and the result is a bolt that cycles smoothly with less perceived effort. A practiced firer could therefore operate the bolt while keeping his eye on the sights and maintaining correct aim, a skill that Mauser action users found harder to replicate without intense training. Equally important, the number 4 continued the Lee-Enfield family's 10-round capacity. Rather than the 5-round internal magazine used by most world rifles, the Enfield accepted 2 5-round charger clips through its open action and held the equivalent of 10 rounds ready to fire. In practical terms, that meant a British rifleman could deliver twice the immediate firepower of most contemporaries before pausing to reload. Ballistics and construction reinforced the design's suitability. The number 4 Mark I weighed about 9 pounds when loaded and typically carried a 25.2-inch barrel firing the .303 British cartridge, a 174-grain military bullet propelled to roughly 2,440 feet per second in standard loads. Effective aimed fire for a trained man extended to 500 to 600 yards in typical use, with graduated sights available for longer ranges during training. But the decisive factor was doctrine. Britain's musketry regulations and training regime demanded rapid, accurate, aimed fire from individual soldiers. The baseline qualification required 15 aimed rounds per minute at 300 yards. Failing to achieve this standard meant failing annual assessment. In practice, regular soldiers, after thorough training, often achieved 20 to 30 aimed rounds per minute, rates approaching those possible with semi-automatic weapons in the hands of less practiced men. There were famous demonstrations of what that training could achieve. The archives record exceptional feats of speed and accuracy. Sergeant Major Jesse Wallingford, an Olympic marksman and later instructor, famously placed 36 hits on a 48-inch target at 300 yards in a single minute in the early 20th century, a remarkable marksmanship display widely cited by firearms historians. The tactical consequences of disciplined, rapid rifle fire were seen as early as the opening months of the First World War. At Mons in August 1914, a small British expeditionary force, relying heavily on the Lee-Enfield and trained musketry, exacted devastating casualties from advancing German formations. Eyewitness accounts and unit histories describe riflemen positioned on canal banks and embankments, firing into massed enemy ranks and causing appalling losses in minutes. German commanders sometimes overestimated British machine gun numbers, confusing volume of aimed rifle fire for automatic weaponry. While some dramatic claims about German misapprehension of British firepower are difficult to verify fully from German primary sources, the core point is undisputed. The Lee-Enfield enabled tactical effects often associated with automatic fire when employed by trained, cohesive rifle teams.
If this sounds like a doctrinal defense, that is exactly what British military thinking became. Not denial of technological change, but adaptation. The Lee-Enfield was a tool that a trained British Army could exploit to full effect. Now let us follow how that policy played out across the Second World War's theaters. The rifle proved its mettle from the deserts of North Africa to the jungles of Burma and the hedgerows of Northwest Europe. In North Africa, Commonwealth troops advanced and held ground under searing sun and sand, and the Lee-Enfield's action proved reliable in gritty conditions. In the Far East, the rifle endured the worst of climates: monsoon mud, jungle humidity, and hard, improvised usage demanded a weapon that continued to function despite neglect and abuse. Stories of individual endurance became part of the rifle's reputation. For example, rifleman, later Corporal Lakmi Gurung of the 2nd Gurkha Rifles, earned the Victoria Cross in Burma in May 1945 after continuing to fire his Lee-Enfield one-handed for hours following severe wounds. Having lost a hand and with impaired sight, he held his position and inflicted heavy casualties, a grim illustration of both soldierly courage and the rifle's practical usefulness in the hands of determined men. Sniping work further illustrated the Lee-Enfield strengths. The No. 4 Mark I-T 4T sniper variant was a factory selection process. Rifles that demonstrated exceptional accuracy in testing, typically 7 shots in a 5-inch group at 200 yards, were fitted with optics and precision bedding to serve as sniper rifles. Some 24,000 of these sniper conversions were produced during the war, and post-war assessments consistently rank the Lee-Enfield sniper platforms among the most effective bolt-action combat rifles of the mid-20th century. The No. 4T would survive in British service for decades and even be rebarreled and rechambered in 7.62 NATO as the L42A1 for service into the late 20th century. Comparisons with foreign designs sharpen the contrast. The German K98K was a superb target rifle with an inherently stiff front-locking action that promoted fine inherent accuracy. But its 5-round magazine and longer bolt throw made rapid practical shooting slower. Contemporary evaluations often summed up the relative strengths neatly. German rifles were arguably the best target rifles. The Americans offered a superbly practical semi-automatic in the Garand. The British Lee-Enfield was the best battle rifle for massed, fast-aimed fire when used by trained troops. That judgment captures more than technological preference. It reflects doctrine, logistics, and training models. The Garand story is instructive. Britain evaluated the M1 on at least 2 occasions, in 1939 and again in 1943, but ultimately declined to adopt it broadly. The reasons were pragmatic. Large-scale conversion would have required retraining, massive retooling, and disruption to existing supply of .303 ammunition. In addition, British infantry doctrine emphasized the Bren light machine gun as the rifle section's primary sustained fire weapon. Riflemen were intended to support maneuver and provide precision-aimed fire rather than act as the section's main volume weapon. Around 38,000 Garands did reach the UK under Lend-Lease and were used in secondary roles, Home Guard units, and several Royal Marine units. Liking the Garand's semi-automatic rhythm for jungle and close fighting, commandos in Burma and other theaters used them effectively where appropriate.
An important operational insight helped explain British policy in the long term. While a novice could often be trained to use an M1 to good effect relatively quickly, properly trained British riflemen could achieve near parity with semi-automatic users because their doctrine invested heavily in musketry. In other words, the Garand's main advantage was ease of training rather than purely unsurpassable combat performance. Britain compensated for the absence of a standard semi-automatic through aggressive marksmanship training, a 10-round magazine advantage, and a section structure that placed the Bren as the sustained fire element. After Dunkirk, the Germans captured tens of thousands of Lee-Enfields. Estimates fall in the range of roughly 44,000 to 48,000 rifles, and reissued many to secondary units, Volkssturm formations, and occupation detachments. The captured rifles were designated Gewehr 281E in German service. That the Wehrmacht saw value in reusing the rifles reinforces the practical competence of the Enfield design, even to enemies. Ultimately, the Lee-Enfield's longevity is itself a measure of success. The rifle remained Britain's standard infantry arm until the late 1950s, when the adoption of self-loading replacement designs finally rendered bolt actions obsolete for frontline service. Even beyond formal service life, the Enfield persisted. Canadian Rangers used No. 4 rifles well into the 21st century, and police and paramilitary units in parts of South Asia retained Enfields for decades. Over 46 nations adopted variants of the Lee-Enfield in one form or another. Combined production across all marks exceeded 17 million rifles, making it one of the most produced military rifles in history. So were the critics wrong? Not entirely. They correctly forecast that the bolt-action rifle's era as the dominant personal battlefield arm was ending. The future belonged to semi-automatic and later select-fire small arms.
What they underestimated was the capacity of a particular bolt-action design, married to intensive training, a coherent doctrine, and an industrial system that supported it, to remain supremely effective in the crucible of large-scale war. Late 1939 saw Britain approve what many called an anachronism. 6 years of global conflict proved that the decision, judged by combat results rather than theory alone, was not a fatal error. From the deserts of North Africa to the tangled undergrowth of Burma and the beaches and bocage of Northwest Europe, the Lee-Enfield equipped armed forces that defeated Axis powers. Its sniper variants became celebrated for precision. The rifle that some modernizers dismissed as obsolete performed precisely where it needed to, in the hands of soldiers trained to exploit its specific strengths on the battlefields where it was actually used.